I am one of the dietitians here at Eisenhower. I'm actually the nutrition manager here, and I've been here for, I don't know, almost 4 years now. So it's
Oh
been
my
it's been
Lord.
great. So I've been doing a few of these as the years go on. I try to do at least one a year for Brett. But I'm really happy that you were able to join me here today, doing a topic that I just honestly find interesting myself, so I'm hoping that this appeals to some of you as well, and that some of it maybe you've heard before, and I'm hoping that there's a few things in here, there's just a little bit of new information that I found interesting, so I hope that that you do as well. So talking just about food and mood, just to give you an idea of what we're going to spend some time talking about, just a little about nutrition and the brain in general. Certainly there's a lot of observational evidence out there about a link between what we eat and our mood and how we feel. I'm going to walk you through a really great study, a really good randomized control trial that came out. And then after that, I actually want to talk about the gut more than anything, which is kind of surprising when you first think about brain. That's maybe not your first thought, but we're going to head right into gut health for a good chunk of today's presentation. So as far as mental health goes, I think we all know that this is something that certainly a lot of people are facing. We know that depression and anxiety related disorders are amongst the most common mental health illnesses in the United States and truly around the world. That it's estimated that about 1 in 4 American adults have some sort of mental health condition. And this is related to a whole number of factors, certainly genetic and biological. Social circumstances play a large part, certainly environmental situations that the person may have been in, and socioeconomic status. Looking at depression, certainly the gold standard of treatment and care is psychotherapy and medication. But I think we're appreciating a little bit more how lifestyle-based care can also help support all of that. So everything from exercise and smoking cessation and mindfulness and sleep, social support. And what I want to spend today talking about is diet. But before we go any farther, I just want to be really clear with all of this, that certainly diet is meant to be really playing a supporting role in any sort of mental health care. That certainly is not a replacement in any way for psychotherapy and medication. That's really the standard of care. But I just want to explore ways that, we're finding out more how diet, can maybe play a part, and really support that. So let's just talk about the brain for a minute first. It's the most metabolically active organ in the body. It's only 2% of our body weight, but it takes up and uses about 20% of all the calories that we take in during the day. It's made up of billions of nerve cells called neurons, and it communicates through these electrical and chemical signals. Neurotransmitters are really those chemicals that carry signals through the brain. And you've probably heard of some of these before. Serotonin is often called the happy hormone. Dopamine's associated with pleasure and motivation. And GABA is known to be associated with anxiety and stress and calmness. So all of those things play a part in how we're feeling. And we know that nutrition is extremely important for brain health as well. Starting just at the basics of, brain structure and functioning. We know that it has this high metabolic rate, so it's important to make sure that we're giving it adequate nutrition so that it works its best, and really to give those building blocks for some of the things that the brain needs, like building these neurotransmitters so that it's working and functioning properly. We also know that nutrition plays a big part in oxidative processes and immune system functioning. So again, all of those things, just that supporting role in having our brain working its best. We know that poor diet quality is associated with poor cognition, fatigue, memory loss, and mood disorders. So the hippocampus, that's the part of the brain that plays a critical role in the formation and consolidation of memory. It's central to learning and mood and mental health. And not sure if you've heard this term neuroplasticity before. That's really just the idea of your brain's ability to learn and adapt as it sort of experiences new things. Now, this BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is really something that helps promote that neuroplasticity and support that ability to learn and create these new memories. And that, of course, is related to diet. We know that that diet impacts that, and that's important because it then impacts, sort of the size of the hippocampus and how it works, and we know that's related to depression and anxiety as well. So on the right side of the screen here, you'll see, from a diet standpoint, probably not too surprising, that, if you have a diet that's high in fat and sugar, that's not necessarily working the best for you. Um, that this BDNF tends to work better when there's more omega-3s and polyphenols, which is a nice phytochemical, and some of these minerals that we have listed here too. So really just that broad across the board, making sure that your brain has what it needs. Another factor is the HPA axis, and that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That's the main neuroendocrine regulator of the stress response. And we know that the adrenal glands produce cortisol. We know that's the stress hormone. And then inflammation can disrupt the HPA axis, resulting in higher levels of cortisol. And we know that that's then associated with anxiety and depression. So what can we do to really maintain, again, that HPA axis and working its best? There's some diet things that are associated with that too. Vitamin C, omega-3s, all of those things can be beneficial. We know that diets that are high glycemic index, so some of those diets that tend to be pretty refined carbs and high simple sugars, can work against that. And then we know that some of the pre and probiotics can also be beneficial. So it's interesting. We know that diet quality is associated with a lower risk for developing depression and anxiety. And in the past, and this is kind of true of nutrition in general, there was a lot of focus on very specific nutrients and very specific foods. Like we were really focused on, is it the B vitamins or is it omega-3? And what is the impact of that on depression? And I think more and more, the research is sort of heading in a different direction. They're looking more and appreciating more of the fact that, nutrition and its impact on our health is pretty complex. And it usually involves more of an interaction between different nutrients and different foods. And it's sort of that how everything works in combination that's really making a bigger difference. So there's this shift in some of the research that's looking more towards diet patterns, and sort of that whole picture of how it's working together. And it even goes back to, very traditional diets. If you look at Mediterranean or traditional Japanese or some of the Scandinavian diets, these diets, they all seem to have very common features. So this slide here is really just, it was this big meta-analysis that was done of sort of all this observational data that had been around, for years, looking at what's a healthy diet. So they came up with these commonalities, and it really comes down to, the same things, regardless of which part of the world you may be living in. It comes down to plant foods, more fruits and veggies, more legumes, more nuts and seeds, all the whole grains, lean proteins, and fish. And that's sort of across the board. And then on the other side of things, sort of what are those common foods that are seen in all these patterns that are associated with depression? And that comes down to processed foods and sugar and excess alcohol intake. So we know that chronic illness is associated with oxidative stress and inflammation, and depression's really no different. It has the same, sort of impact. Oxidative stress, when you hear about that, it's really the imbalance between free radicals and antioxidants, and that can lead to some cell damage and dysfunction. From the inflammation side, not all inflammation is bad. Certainly something that's acute, if you have an acute cut or burn or that type of thing, that you're going to have that immediate immune response to try to heal that. And that's fine. The problem is that if you have more of a chronic inflammation situation, your body is really setting yourself up to, really alter the metabolism of some of these neurotransmitters and how some of these signaling pathways are really impacted. And that's known to be associated with depression too. So what are the things that tend to lead towards this chronic inflammation? It's all the things we're all kind of guilty of, right? Obesity and smoking and alcohol and chronic stress, poor diet, lack of exercise, poor sleep. So I think it's fair to say probably all of us experience all of this on some level, that it's how do we, just make some steps towards cleaning that up a little bit and trying to reduce that sort of chronic stress around ourselves all the time. Big part of that, not surprising, is these inflammatory foods. Is anything that falls under that classification of the Western diet, are all playing a part in that. So everything from processed foods, refined white kind of grains, saturated fats, added sugars. We're hearing more and more about this term ultra processed foods. Um, these, what, let me stop here. I'm going to read you a very specific description of exactly what this is. So this is the definition. I think it sounds a little disturbing. I don't know if I want to eat these things, but we all do. So technically an ultra processed food is an industrial formulation generated through compounds extracted, derived, or synthesized from food or food substrates. That sounds delicious, doesn't it? But the reality is that about 60% of the calories of the average American is coming from ultra processed foods. These are hyper palatable foods. They're designed with the perfect combination of sort of that salty, sweet, crunchy fattiness that we all love, and they're easy to overeat these types of things. Usually they have more than 5 ingredients. And I think the best way to think about them really is that, it's usually ingredients that you wouldn't find in a home kitchen. So that we're talking about things like emulsifiers and artificial colors and flavors and preservatives, those types of things. So really trying to be conscious of, how can you reduce the intake of some of these foods is certainly going to be beneficial. So this is probably the best recognized healthy diet pattern that's out there. The Mediterranean diet, I'm sure we've all heard and seen it before. And just a reminder, so looking at it, you see that the biggest chunk of that pyramid towards the bottom, really that focus on all of the fruits and the veggies and the whole grains. That's really where the bulk of our calories in our food should be coming from in the day. And then as we move up that pyramid, making sure that we get some good protein sources in there. So fish and seafood and poultry and eggs and cheese. And then at the very top, that's where we have the sweets and those sort of extra foods hidden in the top. Not to say you can never eat those things, but certainly when you stand back and look at the proportion, you just want that to be the smallest part. And then I just want to highlight the little part on the bottom. I think sometimes we forget that part of the Mediterranean diet, that it's really looking at lifestyle in general, that it really does also try to encourage being physically active, and really important, just social connections and interactions too, and the impact that has on our overall well-being. So the Mediterranean diet, I think we all think of it first from the sort of those heart health benefits. But it really is coming from the anti-inflammatory and antioxidants that are part of it, that high plant food intake, those healthy fats, and really the minimal amount of sugar and red meats and processed foods. But again, like versus, sort of pulling apart each one of those single items and sort of focusing on how that really makes a difference. It's really sort of standing back and looking at, what's the cumulative effect of all of these things and how do they all work together to really give us the best health outcomes. So looking at some of them now, the omega-3 fats, you just can't really go wrong with these. We know that there's we all have that ratio of sort of omega-6 to omega-3 fat intake in our diet. And we know that having a higher ratio of omega-6 is associated with depression. So certainly most people get the bulk of their omega-6 from processed foods, any sort of higher fat, higher oil types of foods, that's where you're getting most of that, any sort of fast food, that type of thing. Whereas the omega-3, a lot of people don't struggle to get enough fish in. So that ratio tends to be off for a lot of people. The two main components of omega-3 is sort of the DHA and the EPA, and they have slightly different benefits for our brain. The DHA really is more of a structural thing for our brain cells, whereas the EPA tends to help just with the function of those nerve cells, the blood flow and inflammation, but overall helping with memory, mood, attention, and cognitive performance. So just that reminder, sort of aiming for about 3 servings if we can of fish per week. So another big part of the Mediterranean diet is really the antioxidants. And it's also been shown to help protect against depression. That's where we get into that oxidative stress and, sort of that balance between the free radicals, that we all make, that's part of normal body functioning, but certainly being exposed to smoke and stress and all the rest, is gonna push up those free radicals. So this helps offset all of that. So some of the sort of go-to examples are listed here, things like vitamin C and vitamin E. Flavonoids are a great one with berries, that type of thing, lycopene here and tomatoes, all really good choices. But again, it's not even just, one that's the superstar. It's really that combination of how do you get all of these things, because everything is contributing and having just a slightly different effect in your body, but they all work together. Okay, so up till this point, a lot of what we've been talking about is observational data. There's a lot of, sort of survey type things and looking at human populations in general and kind of pulling these general things together. Um, I wanted to highlight this randomized control trial. It's a few years old now, 2017, but this is an important one. So it's called SMILES. That stands for Supporting the Modification of Lifestyle in Lowered Emotional States. It was done at a university in Australia. And this one is important because this is the first human randomized trial where there was actually an intervention that happened, so that they were trying to show if we actually change someone's diet and what is the impact. So that's a little different than sort of just looking population wise trying to see trends. This is really looking at, did our intervention make a difference? So they had 67 participants. Everybody who started this trial had sort of moderate to severe depression. So what they did, divided them randomly into 2 groups. So the intervention group had 7 sessions with a dietitian, where they talked about this Modi Med diet. And I'll show you in the next slide what that is. Essentially, it's just a sort of modified version of the Mediterranean diet. So in each one of those sessions, they really focused on, nutrition education and goal setting and just how to implement some of these guidelines and working together to reach those goals. On the flip side, you always need a control group. And we know that, especially for individuals with depression, it makes a really big difference having any sort of social interaction. So they tried to have this control group matched for the 7 sessions, something they call befriending. So there's still that social interaction, the same amount of time. But in this case, they came in and just talked about neutral topics with someone, and I read this day, they were talking about, if they ran out of things to talk about, they played board games together, so anything where there was just that social part, but certainly nothing as far as sort of intervention on the nutrition side of things. So here's just a quick summary of that diet. It looks very, very much like a Mediterranean diet. The couple things to point out that are just a little bit different. There's a little bit more of a emphasis on lean red meats, and I think that's just reflective of sort of healthy diet patterns in Australia. That's part of what they recommend. And then down at the sort of on the right side, there are 3 extras per week was what they were trying to have people aim for. And that was sort of your fast food, sweets, junk food kind of thing. And just as a reference point, the average participant in this study was starting out with about 21 of these extras per week. So they were trying to get people down to about 3. So what they found out was after 12 weeks of doing this, there was a really significant reduction in the depression score of these participants, that about 32% actually reached the level of what they would clinically define as remission of their depression symptoms, which is huge. That's a huge impact. So they basically summarize saying, that this healthy, nutrient-rich diet really might have some therapeutic effects and benefits for their participants and patients. One of the things that they really did highlight, though, was that people could eat as much as they wanted in this study, so there was no emphasis whatsoever on trying to lose weight. And in the end, their participants really didn't lose weight. So they were able to say, hey, the benefits were really from the diet quality and not necessarily from the weight loss. They also really highlighted the fact, too, that, there was very few people who really followed that diet perfectly, that, the benefits were seen even from improvements in diet. Like I said, those 21 extras that people started with, very few people hit that 3 number, but, a lot of people got to 7 or 8 or 10, and even seeing those improvements resulted in improvements in depression, which is pretty amazing. So this was sort of the first one, and it gets referred back to all of the time. It's been repeated and slightly different versions of it, and it's showing the same sort of outcomes, which is really promising. So one of the mechanisms that they think, some of these Mediterranean diet patterns have, sort of the benefits of it, is really on the microbiota, and really looking at gut health. And that's how we're gonna spend most of the rest of the afternoon here, is talking about some of that. But I like this picture here because it just is a simple way of sort of explaining what's going on. So the diet is going to impact the microbiome and what your microbiota is eating. And that is going to increase the short chain fatty acids, which is a good thing. That's going to help decrease inflammation in the brain, increase serotonin signaling, and ultimately help with lowering depression symptoms. And then on the flip side, it also helps lower endotoxin, which sounds like it's not a great thing for your brain, and it's not. It tends to cause inflammation in the brain. So staying away from that. Now, I'm hoping that you've heard of the gut-brain axis before. So this is, sort of best described a lot of times as, sort of those feelings. We know the two are connected, right? That gut feeling that you might have about something, or certainly that idea of butterflies in your stomach. You know when you're stressed, you feel it in your stomach, that type of thing. So these two things are very certainly connected. Oftentimes the gut is called the second brain, or more technically, the enteric nervous system. And it gets this name really because there's just this huge network of nerves and neurons and neurotransmitters that are in the gut, sort of second only to the brain. This is the highest number that we have in our body. The gut is the main producer of neurotransmitters. So that's where, about 90% of the serotonin in your body is made in your gut. And the main way that your gut and your brain, sort of connect and talk to each other, is through the vagus nerve. This is a nerve that connects the brain down to the GI tract. And it sends signals and information both ways. For instance, the gut will send signs to your brain, hey, we've had enough food intake, or there's gut distension, or the nutrient levels that are in your gut, so that your brain knows what's going on. And then on the flip side, your brain will send messages down to your gut. But things like it would help control gastric motility, how fast something's moving through your gut, secretions of enzymes, blood flow to your gut, all of those sorts of things. So it's sort of a constant back and forth of sharing of information. And this happens through a few different pathways. The first is neurotransmitters, which, like I said, get produced in the gut. So these are sort of the chemical communication. The serotonin is the big one. Second, a lot of hormone signaling back and forth. Ghrelin is a really big one. That's a hormone that's produced in the GI tract, and it signals up to your brain that you're hungry. Leptin is sort of the reverse of that. That signals to your brain that, hey, I'm full, I'm satisfied. We can stop eating. So those are certainly going to impact our metabolism and ultimately our mood as well. And then there's a good amount of information back and forth from the immune system as well. That a lot of that is really sort of triggered by the gut and the gut microbiota and some of the products that it makes as well. So the neurotransmitter that probably gets the most attention is serotonin. That one's known as the happy hormone. And we know that it's the transmission of serotonin is altered in depression, certainly to the point that SSRIs are the most prescribed treatment for depression. So we know that there's a link there. And most of that serotonin is produced in the digestive tract. So what we need to have is a healthy gut, because then that healthy gut is able to produce serotonin more efficiently. So anytime that there's changes in the gut microbiome, that's going to impact the ability to make this serotonin and sort of the ability of how that functions. I love this little picture here. Just, it seems like a great summary of all of this, sort of how all of this, the gut and the brain communicate, so everything from, starting at the gut, those neurotransmitters that, can then pass along information and impact anxiety levels and mood and stress. All of that goes back to the brain. And then on the other side, the brain certainly controls, sort of that nutrient delivery and how the microbiome works. It controls how fast things move through the GI system, and then the secretion of enzymes and digestive enzymes and that type of thing. So let's talk more about the microbiome. It's home to trillions of microorganisms. It's really an ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, viruses, parasites. And we really have this symbiotic relationship with it. We're a great host, we're a great home for all of these bacteria. And then on the flip side, these bacteria do so much for us. And I think we're learning more and more about what they are doing, that all of these byproducts that they make impact so many parts of our lives, and especially with mood and depression and anxiety, all of those sorts of things. The microbiome really helps to digest food. It synthesizes and improves the bioavailability of certain nutrients, things like vitamin B12 and thiamine and vitamin K. All of that's related to microorganisms in the gut that we rely on to make some of those vitamins for us. It increases our resilience to infection, and it protects our intestinal lining against toxins and bad bacteria. It's really important to maintain that healthy gut barrier. And all of this, of course, then has an impact on our brain as well, and brain function, behavior, and mental health. That production of the neurotransmitters really all happens in the gut. And then going back to that BDNF that I mentioned at the beginning, the neuroplasticity and the making of memories and learning new things, that again, sort of comes down to these microorganisms in the gut and being able to produce some of these chemicals for us. So as soon as we have some sort of imbalance in our gut, it really does, it impacts everything. It really does set off this sort of flow of inflammation, and that all eventually leads back to how we're feeling. So dysbiosis is just the sort of the way to describe that imbalance in our gut. Um, and it can be triggered by different things. A lot of times it's you know antibacterials can sometimes do something for us, that works against it. But ultimately, it's a loss of beneficial bacteria. And even more important probably than the overall number is the loss of diversity of bacteria. So there's all these trillions of organisms, but it's really important that we have all different strains and species of these bacteria because they all do slightly different things for us. So it's important to have a diverse growth there. And then the more healthy, good bacteria you have, it helps prevent, this overgrowth of potentially pathogenic bacteria. One of the best ways that I've heard, sort of a description of this is sort of it's a bit cheesy, but a garden analogy. So that idea of, if you have this garden full of great, beautiful flowers and you take good care of it and you feed it right and you fertilize and everything you're supposed to do, your plants are going to thrive and be beautiful. The problem is if you don't feed them properly and you don't fertilize them and take care of them, that's when all the bad weeds kind of start taking over. It's the same sort of idea. The better we can feed our gut, the healthier and happier it's going to be. So not surprising, the same things come up all of the time. It's that idea of these processed foods and additives and preservatives and antibiotics. All of these things work against that balance of the sort of good and bad bacteria. So let's talk a minute about the short chain fatty acids. So these are really the superstars of the whole story here. This is so these are the beneficial products that these microorganisms produce whenever they eat fiber. So essentially the fiber, we don't digest it, it gets down into our colon, and that's what all of these microorganisms eat. And then they produce these short chain fatty acids. And this is really what's so beneficial for us. There's three that are sort of the most abundant and best known acids: acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And these are important because they're sort of the main source of energy for the cells lining the colon. And that's important because that helps protect that gut barrier, that intestinal barrier, that helps prevent inflammation. It also, because these are acids, then that lowers the pH inside the gut. And a lot of the beneficial good bacteria prefer to be in more of an acidic environment. So it just sort of, it keeps going on itself. The more of these, the healthier the bacteria. And then the healthier bacteria make more short chain fatty acids. So it just sort of, it keeps going that way. It also has an impact then on anti-inflammatory properties as well, and helps modulate the immune response, and just helping to protect against oxidative stress. So this also has, not surprisingly, a big impact on our brain health as well. One of those short chain fatty acids, the butyrate, is the preferred energy for neurons in the brain. So that really supports cognitive function. This also stimulates the production of neurotransmitters. So again, our serotonin, we want more of that. It affects the function of microglia cells. So these are little cells that are in the brain that actually help, sort of with cleanup of things. They sort of take care of, dead cells and processing things that shouldn't be there. And, so just keeping things functioning and clean and working the way it's supposed to. So we need that. It stimulates neural growth, so just healthier brain cells, which then translates into improved cognitive performance and learning and mood and depression and anxiety, all of that. with this, like I said, these are really the little superstars. This is what it's all about. There's definitely theories of, well, okay, is this something we can take advantage of and package up in some way, to help us as some sort of antidepressant, and it's sort of pointing that direction potentially, but nowhere near something that could be used clinically yet. But there's certainly a lot of interest in this. And then just going back to the immune system, we don't necessarily think of it this way all the time, but our gut is really the largest immune system organ in our whole body. It contains most of the body's immune cells. So having that diverse gut microbiota really reduces inflammation and decreases risk for mental health disorders. Diet certainly influences, sort of the microorganisms themselves, and then the products that they produce, the metabolites that they produce. The short chain fatty acids maintain that gut barrier. They keep the bacteria and bacterial toxins, in the colon where they belong versus sort of leaking out and escaping into your bloodstream. So what can we do to have a nice, happy, healthy microbiome? I think the first thing is always coming back to, sort of that plant-rich diet, um, fruits, veggies, whole grains, getting plenty of fiber and plenty of polyphenols. And I'll talk about some of these things in a bit more detail for you. Fermented foods are a huge one, pre and probiotics. Avoiding processed foods. There's some data out there that suggests that some of the artificial sweeteners and certainly some of the emulsifiers, so those things that add texture and shelf life and stability to some processed foods, aren't the healthiest for our gut microbiome. Avoiding alcohol, and then using antibiotics with care. Not that you can't, but certainly using them only when they're really necessary. And all of this has an impact on it. But the microbiome too is known to be, sort of very, very personalized, sort of like fingerprint type of thing, that no two people really have the same build, sort of makeup of micro organisms in our microbiome. So a lot of it has to do with, sort of the foods that we eat, but some of it goes way back to when we were born. This is something that we can't change everything about it, because it really is early life that has influence on it too. So anything from if you were born vaginally versus C-section versus, and if you're breastfed, if you had pets as a kid, if you played in the dirt, all of those things also had a really big part in building that sort of unique microbiome for you. So some of that can't necessarily be changed, but certainly you can make it the healthiest it possibly can be, by focusing on foods and taking care of things now. So let's talk a little bit more about fiber. So that's the part that we don't digest. So it's not helpful, from a calorie standpoint or anything for us. But this is the food for the microorganisms. This is what we want. So again, really focusing on all those plant foods, and a variety of plant foods is really the key. We know that fiber has an impact on bowel habits, keeping us regular. It helps fill us up. Um, and it has a role in just regulating our blood sugars as well. If we have something with more fiber in it, we're not necessarily going to have a sort of a blood sugar spike the way we would if we had something that was much more refined. Fiber is great from a phytochemical standpoint. Just lots of antioxidants and that type of thing that help protect against oxidative stress, and of course then contributing to gut microbiome diversity. So one of these fibers is prebiotic fibers, and this is really the preferred food by your microbiota. Um, it really, sort of the chemical properties of it, these fibers tend to be, more soluble, and they tend to be more fermentable than some other fibers. So all of that, sort of the chemical makeup of them, has impact then on how, sort of what's made then by your microbiome, what kind of metabolites are being made. Um, But essentially, whenever they get broken down and fermented and essentially kind of eaten by these, microbiome, these short chain fatty acids are then released as a result. So lowering the pH makes a really big difference. It is preferred by those good bacteria, and it helps keep some of the harmful ones in check. One of the big ones, is C. diff. There's definitely some information about that. That's sort of a common one in people who have a lot of antibiotic use, and sometimes older individuals who are hospitalized. C. diff can be a really big problem as far as infection. So any of that lowering the pH and keeping it more acidic is helpful. Some of the best sources of prebiotic fibers are inulin, any sort of resistant starches, gums, pectins, fructooligosaccharides. So some of these you'll see in um, supplement format and sort of powders and things like that. On the food side of things, garlic, onions, leeks, asparagus, Jerusalem artichokes, green bananas, some of the whole grains and fruits and seeds. There's a lot of really good sources of prebiotic fiber. So the more we can introduce some of those into our diet is always helpful as well. Polyphenols are another phytochemical that often comes hand in hand with some of these higher fiber, good for us foods. These are the chemicals that really give the color to a lot of fruits and vegetables. But we also see them in some legumes and nuts and seeds, even in some coffee and tea, even in red wine. These are all the colorful sort of antioxidant types of things. Um, just by their nature, they're really minimally absorbed by our body until they reach the colon. So again, as soon as anything kind of reaches the colon intact like that, that makes for great bacteria food. So the bacteria can break these down too into metabolites that are helpful for us, that can help provide sort of neuroprotective effects, help with cognitive performance, and again, sort of associated with lower rates of depression. So fermented foods are something that I think, a lot more of us are including in our diets a little bit more regularly. And they're nothing new. Certainly they've been around for centuries, across all different cultures and different parts of the world, initially coming from a means of preserving food. So all of these things have sort of a natural high level of prebiotics and probiotics in them. They have a lot of healthy bacteria just right in the food itself. So eating these things just adds another level of diversity into our colon, into our microbiota, that is healthy for us. Um, Having more of these foods has been shown to encourage the growth of more healthy species in your gut. So the more, we can just, really focus on getting those good ones that help crowd out some of the bad bacteria and keep our gut as healthy as we can. Helps regulate immunity, improve digestive function, reduce inflammation. So some of the go-to ones for a lot of people are yogurt, kimchi. If you haven't tried it, try it. It's delicious. Sauerkraut is one that, I probably should have paid more attention to my older Polish grandma. She knew what she was doing. So, all of those traditional foods, really, really making a place for is important. Some of the other ones are kombuchas and kefir are easy to find. And that's a pretty safe, easy place to start with. Anytime you are looking for this type of thing, make sure you're looking the labels, for live active cultures, and these products are generally refrigerated so that the bacteria are still there and live. But good things to try. It's not. I would say none of them are easy to jump into and just necessarily love. There's you kind of have to start slow, and I think your tastes for some of these things do increase just with frequency and just becoming more familiar with them. So with all of this, it sort of begs the question, should I just take a probiotic supplement? Is that going to help? Well, maybe, yes, I don't know. Yes, there's certainly a lot of evidence out there that does suggest, that the more probiotics that we have in our digestive system, that's going to support gut health. Maybe better coming from the food, but certainly there's probiotic possibilities out there. A lot of animal studies have demonstrated that there is impact, especially on antidepressant effects and just helping cognition. Not as much research so far in humans, but it's getting there. There's just sort of a lack of consistency in this. Um, but one of the things that you sort of have to think about too is just what exactly are you taking? We're talking about this probiotic ecosystem where there's literally hundreds of different strains of bacteria, and how do they all work together and coexist, and that balance of everything. That a lot of researchers are saying we just don't necessarily know enough yet. Is this one particular strain going to change and improve everything for you? That it really is sort of a combination of a bunch of strains that might actually work the best. So we don't know. Maybe, maybe there is some value to it. The one thing to think about is just, always when you're talking about supplements is just looking at the quality of it and just being confident in what it is that you're purchasing. There isn't, really the same regulation on supplements as other drugs and medications. So you don't necessarily know that what's on the label is necessarily in the supplement. You just want to make sure that you're taking sort of the best one you can and do as much research as you can. So that's sort of where it is. That's not a good answer, but yes, maybe, but hopefully with more research and we can sort of pinpoint what strains are the best for some of us and in what situations they might be the most helpful for us. So I really like this one, this 30 plants a week. This is something that I've seen multiple different people online and doctors and books and you name it, sort of talking about this idea of aiming for 30 plants a week. And it comes back to this project called the American Gut Project that was done, where they had thousands of people send in stool samples and then at the same time answer surveys about what types of food they normally ate. And so basically this group discovered that, if you ate more than 30 different plants a week, you seem to have a much better, greater microbiome diversity. And that's ultimately the most beneficial. So this isn't the best. There's some argument about it that the number's a bit arbitrary and the portions and all the rest, but it's kind of fun. You can't really go wrong with having more plants in your life and really more variety, because again, it sort of comes back to the more variety of fiber you have in there. All of these different strains of bacteria have a preferred fiber that they like eating. So if you have different kinds of fiber, you're going to have different kinds of microbiome, microbacteria, and different products being made. So this 30 plants is great. So even just little things like, if say you always had an apple every single day as your afternoon snack, fantastic. But what happens if, you change it up from buying, 5 of the same apples for the week? Now you buy even 1 red apple and 1 green apple. That counts as 2 different kinds of plants, and then change it up with, 3 other different fruits during the week. So you're having 5 different ones is more beneficial than having just your 5 same red apples every day. So just something fun to think about. And then I thought I'd throw in just a few, sort of things that caught my attention, just sort of new research that they're looking at. So they know that there's association between depression and certain types of bacteria. And I think, there's different groups of researchers that are really trying to pull this apart. There's a lot of stool samples out there, they're looking at, what exact bacteria are in some of these samples with the people with depression, and really trying to pull out, okay, are there commonalities to this, and what are those bad bacteria, and what are the ones, so they're really trying to figure out sort of the specifics of some of it. Welcome to the world of fecal transplants. So far, most of this has been done in rodents, and so what they were doing was they were taking human samples, so human stool samples from people who had depression, and they were putting that into rats and mice that had a germ-free gut, so introducing that microbiome to the rodent, and next thing you knew, these rats and mice were having, sort of depressive symptoms and showing signs of that. So there's all these, sort of impact of, yes, the microbiome definitely does impact this. So now they're starting to look at this with humans too, that, changing that microbiome and introducing some of those new bacteria, is that going to help people? So really fascinating stuff. Next thing, is sort of looking at, well, how do you really target this to people? We're looking more and more at, sort of very personalized medicine, and what does your specific gut look like, and what does that bacteria, sort of variety look like? What's missing? What's there? And sort of looking at, okay, well, if we then supplement with very specific strains of probiotics, and then the preferred food that these probiotics enjoy, does all of this work together to create a very specific treatment for someone? It's fascinating stuff, but we're just not quite there yet. And then this idea of psychobiotics. So this is specific probiotics that have been shown in animal trials so far, but to improve anxiety and depression. So just really interesting things out there that, when you think about it, 20 years ago, we didn't talk about this at all. We didn't know anything about this, and here's where we are today. That it'll be fascinating to see, 10 years from now, do we have some really great treatments, based on our gut bacteria. So I thought I'd just wrap up here with some general diet recommendations, and just kind of pulling all of this together. Well, what can we do today, that would make a difference? And I think a lot of it comes down to just looking at that whole food diet, trying to get away from the processed foods as much as we can, and just, sort of that homemade, what can plant food based type of diet, and filling up on that. The more colors we can get, the more antioxidants and phytochemicals that diet is providing. And looking at, getting fiber from such a variety of as many different sources as we possibly can. And then venturing into experimenting with a bit more fermented foods as well. So pulling all of those things together. But I think I also want to remind you too, it's sort of like that trial that was done in Australia. It's always like, what's your starting point? That it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to aim for that perfection. That, even moving the gauge a little bit closer to that, still seem to have some really positive impacts for people. So that's where I'm going to end it today, and see if there's any questions from anybody.
Oh, so awesome as always. Now I'm hungry as well.
But for something delicious like this, with some tomatoes and chickpeas.
Right. I wish that, So the question actually is kind of funny, because it's appropriate. I say, what wine pairing do you have with this? So the question in the chat is, I heard recent studies showed having even one glass of red wine every day is actually not healthy for us. Is that correct?
Oh my gosh, I wish I had paid more attention to that, because I heard that on the news too, and I never actually ventured into it. There's so many things, right? That are we overestimating that that antioxidant and the resveratrol and all of those good things? Is that really it? But then on the flip side of it, there's a lot of research that's looking at, especially in the cancer world, and sort of risk of cancer, that we know that alcohol is not good for us. It's a carcinogen. That again, are we sort of overestimating its benefits, and not looking at, there's some risks with this too, that maybe, sort of a global, yeah, go ahead and have your glass or two of red wine, that's great, maybe isn't the best advice for everyone. So yeah, no, I'm sorry, I definitely heard the headline, but I didn't actually see the research on that. I can't go back to exactly what that was, but I'm interested too.
All right. Well, that was it for the chat. So let's go ahead and open up. Oh, wait, there's another one here. And then we can open up for live questions. With a diagnosis of EPI, can this be changed over time with proper diet?
I think with all of this, I always want people to look at diet as supportive. that I don't know if anything you can say can be cured with diet. That's probably overstepping a lot. But I think just looking at trying to keep that baseline of your diet as, sort of the healthiest you can so that your body is functioning as optimally as it can. Just as that healthy base for everything. So no, I don't think I would jump that far, but certainly, you can't go wrong with focusing on improving diet.
Yeah, another obviously diet question. The Mediterranean diet had so many foods. Would calorie count still be at an RDA?
I think so. Because you have to think like the calories of some of these foods aren't incredibly high. When we're talking about, a diet that's really high in veggies and some of these, sort of plant proteins and things like that, you'd have to eat quite a volume to exceed that for sure. That as far as I know, I think if you follow, sort of the sort of general guidelines of it, you end up in sort of that, 2000-ish calories a day, which would provide GRI for most people.
All right. So let's open up for any live questions. Feel free. Just unmute yourself. Let's be courteous of each other and just ask a question of Lisa.
But can we open this up and take the PowerPoint down so we can kind of see everybody?
We can.
I can't seem to find that on here. So
You want me to stop
yeah,
sharing?
if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your side, Lisa,
Okay.
and that will then.
Okay.
And I'll take. Let's see. Yeah. So go ahead if everybody wants to remove the spotlight. So there we go. Everybody's in the room now. If everybody wants to, or anybody would like to unmute and ask a question, please feel free to do so. That was a lot of information. And Candace, any thoughts from you?
no, I think the questions that I had were all kind of answered. So it was a very thorough
Good.
discussion. Yeah.
And so much of this too, there isn't a lot necessarily that's very specific to any specific condition or disease, or I don't think it's necessarily at that point. That a lot of this, I know it does come across as fairly general, but I do think that's sort of the nature of it. That just that general healthy food, healthy gut. It's going to impact everything, whether it is the inflammation part. It's, everything is so interconnected that it's hard to pull it apart, that this food is going to help this, sort of condition. I don't think we have that yet. I think we just sort of have these sort of patterns of eating that we know are good for us.
Another question that did come in is any dietary recommendations for PCOS? Some of these I don't know what they mean, but PCOS.
Just
PCOS?
yeah, probably it's probably that same type of thing, that just yes, the same, where you're looking at healthy foods, whole foods, that sorry, I see the PCOS on there. It was missing the S, I think, initially. Same type of thing, where you just have all of this, as much variety as possible. I think a lot always comes down to that diversity, that there isn't any one food that's fantastic. All these foods are great for us, but it's not like we need to pick apart, oh, it's only berries, that's the answer. No, that's not necessarily the case, because they don't have things that other healthy foods do. So it's really just that spectrum of, just diversity as much as you can.
Great. Other questions? Feel free, someone.
Yeah, hi, Lisa, Brian here.
Sure.
I had a question for you. I'm proud of myself. I did get my diabetes, those numbers below. I'm back to pre-diabetic, and I did that through doing keto. But my triglycerides got real high, started another cholesterol medicine, and they gave me the dietitian. And the dietitian said, "Look, you're the only person I have that's doing this. You need to get some more complex carbohydrates." So I've been doing that, and I actually think that's a good thing for me. But my question to you is this: I probably eat half of my calories within 2 hours of going to bed at night. And I'm wondering if you have any remedies that could help me with that. It's been that way my whole life. So
I know it's a hard one, right? You know that, and I think I ultimately do think that everybody is different. You know, we are all different. And I don't think there's one right answer that, you know, is going to work for everyone's body. You know, there are some people who may do really well with eating, you know, small little meals and they're constantly nibbling at something. There's some people that do better with a couple bigger meals in the day. And that's fine. I think it's what works best for you, that you're feeling satisfied and energetic and feeling your best. There, you know, sort of there's been research looking at, does it really matter what time you eat? You know, and ultimately a lot of people argue it doesn't. You know, it comes down to, well, how many calories did you eat? That it doesn't matter if you ate 2,000 calories in 2 meals or if you ate it in 6 meals, it's 2,000 calories. The only kind of argument against that sometimes is, you know, sort of at night, sometimes our choices aren't maybe the same because we're tired, and you know it's just harder to pick healthier things sometimes. So if that's a factor, you know, that could play a part. um but generally speaking, it, you know, you sort of want to do what works well for you. By having, you know, sort of meals maybe a little bit earlier, some people find that they, you know, they just feel that they digest better and sleep better, and that makes them feel better. But I think it really does, you know, there's a wide variety of what's healthy for all of us. We have to find what feels best for us.
Great, thank you.
thanks, Lisa.
Go ahead. Okay, then. Candace, any comments from your side?
No, just thank you so much, Lisa, for all this wonderful information. And obviously, from what people are saying in the chat, they appreciate all that great information that they received tonight, too.
Nutrition's always so hard, right? You know, like we hear so many things and so many conflicting pieces of information that it's hard. You know, we don't, in the end, what's right? What are we supposed to do? You know, and I really always try to encourage people to go back to those, like the real basics. And I said that, I feel like I'm a broken record. I said it a million times, you know, but go back to those basics, like eat food, eat real food, you know, eat colors, eat a variety of things, but eat it in a manner that works for you and what you like. And, you know, don't try to force yourself to eat something that you hate, you know, like, you know, that it's more just be consistent with what you know is the good stuff. And don't stress too much about those times when, you know, you do choose something that, hey, that wasn't part of the rainbow, you know. That's fine, that's real life, everybody, that's fine, everybody does that, no problem. But really just looking at, you know, what can you do that's really consistent, because it's that consistency that really makes the biggest impact, you know, sort of in our health, versus like the one-off thing that we do here and there. It really is just do the best you can, and that's it.
You know, I think if we look at our history, and to go back to, like, I'm from Eastern Europe descent and Slavic area, they ate sauerkraut, they ate stuff from the garden, they ate what they had, and they ate.
Mhm.
And so if we, you know, go back to those non-processed, like you were
Yeah.
saying, foods, and the variety that they ate then was pretty dang good. Yeah.
Exactly.
There wasn't a McDonald's on the corner. So thanks so much for everything that you've imparted on us tonight. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. With that, we are at the hour. So Lisa, thank you very much on behalf of all of us. And we will bid you adieu, and everybody to go look at what you're eating now for the next
Yes.
hour. That's what we always will do.
And see you at the next one. When is that one?
I know.
20th, I think. I don't know. It's coming up in 2 weeks.
Absolutely. Thank you
All
all.
right. Thank you.